It's to work, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
recording now.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Right, thank you.
Hello everybody, and thank you for those introductions. Can I just say, as to start off with today, that this is a safe space. So there aren't any wrong questions. It's an opportunity to ask questions, any questions that you might have always wanted to ask and never had the opportunity to do so. And you know, either through the chat or verbally when we get to the Q&A session. Just a little bit about me. I've been on a number of Department of Health advisory groups, one on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I was part of a group that produced some briefing papers for health and social care staff that I think were produced about 2006, 2007. And I was also on Professor Mike Richards' Cancer Inequalities group, and also the implementation group that followed. And I was also invited to a new iteration of the Department of Health advisory group last year, just before the pandemic hit, with the National LGBT Advisor, Dr. Michael Brady. So just to give you a little bit about my background, I first started doing LGBT research for my PhD, and I did a study that was, so this was 20 or more years ago, 25 years ago, and I did a study that looked at lesbians' risk perceptions of cervical and breast screening and their experiences of cancer. And the aim was, my supervisor was quite keen that I got a large scale survey of, and I actually recruited a sample of 1,066 lesbians who at that time were quite reflective of the wider UK population. So I made particular efforts to be inclusive in my approach to recruitment. And I was told by several people, and subsequently, that there weren't 1,000 lesbians to recruit to a study in the UK. So I don't think people will be saying that now, but it just gives you an indication really about how far we've come, but maybe also I think part of this presentation might illustrate some of the ways the journey we still got to go. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the session today. I kind of think it makes sense to understand why LGBTQ research is where it's at, and I think that's partly explained by the historical context. And I've developed a table to explain the reasons for their underrepresentation. I think it's also important to kind of say where we are now, because there's lots of changes and developments, all for the better. And then, I mean, it might be that we might need to pause the recording because I wanted to have group work in the middle of the session rather than at the end. And I know that's slightly unusual, but it's partly to do with a kind of first part of the session to make you feel more comfortable, and then to hand over to you to kind of engage with some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about. And then, you know, you might want to kind of make suggestions as we go through the second part of the presentation, so that you figure it's partly to do with the fact, you know, you've already had an hour's worth of listening to people, and I think we all get a little bit Zoom tired. So I certainly do. I don't know whether you do too. So it's just to kind of offset that kind of Zoom fatigue that we sometimes have. And then I found a paper that was produced through the Wellcome Foundation Open Research Archive on methodological challenges. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some of those issues. And Anna Marie was very keen that I talked about lessons learned. So we've got a section on that, and then resources and references. So that gives you a kind of sense about what I'm going to cover in this section. this session. So forgive me for using this toolkit. It's been produced by East Midlands, the RDS for the East Midlands, who are leading on EDI in the 10 NIHR priorities. And because I wasn't able to find anything that related to LGBT, and Chris and Rebecca had produced this piece of work, in many respects, it's useful to return to this. I have to say, I haven't addressed all of the issues in all of the boxes because there wasn't quite the time. They've spent a year developing this, and I didn't have quite that amount of time. But I think there are lots of issues that are applicable across the board, and it was developed with the thought of it being relevant for every area of equality, diversity and inclusion. I think there are a couple of issues that, you know, now have done this presentation that will kind of help me to feed back to our next meeting in terms of maybe some gaps in this framework. But I think it's a really good place to start, and as that starts with the historical context, that's where I'm going to start too. I don't know whether you've got access to this through the East Midlands Research Design Service. I'm using an older version of PowerPoint, so it doesn't quite fit my slides because they're slightly smaller than the new slides that are being used. So just apologies for the fact that it doesn't all quite fit in the boxes. But I think it's a fantastic resource. I'm, you know, really impressed that they've developed this, and I think there's lots of relevance to LGBTQ plus research. So a little bit about history. So I'm sure you're aware of these, but I think that they do bear repeating. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the American-led, American Psychiatric Association-led manual on the diagnosis of mental health conditions, being lesbian or a gay man particularly, that was only removed from the DSM in 1991. So being lesbian, for example, as I am, was considered in and of itself a mental health condition. And if you're aware about the international classification of the diseases that the World Health Organization produced, being LGB was considered a disease until 1993. Being transgender, in the UK, the Department of Health particularly uses the term trans to suggest movement rather than the status suggested by transgender. So being trans is still included in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the latest iteration, came out, I think, about two years ago. And the diagnosis used to be gender identity disorder, and that has been changed to gender dysphoria. There's a lot of discussion about this because diagnosis gives access to treatment and transitioning and surgery and so on, but it also means that people are diagnosed as having a mental health problem. So there's a lot of debate about those issues. And if you're aware, the Local Government Act of 1988, the so-called infamous Section 28, made a specific link with between LGBT people and disease, and that was only overturned. The legislation was repealed in 2004 or 5. Sorry, I'm partly obscured my slides with your photo. I like to see people as I'm talking, so I've got your photos up on my right hand side. So I feel like I'm talking to people rather than just talking to my slide. And the Equality Act of 2010 brought together, as you will know, it built upon the regulations that were introduced 5 or 6 years previously, which was the first time that LGBT people were protected from discrimination in legislation, and that was then consolidated by the 2010 UK Equality Act, which is quite a significant piece of legislation. And LGBT human rights were first recognised, so that the concept that LGBT people had human rights, were human, was first recognised by the United Nations in 2012. So I think the consequence of this, and various other pieces of what I have previously described as legal penalties, give you a sense in which LGBT lives were seen as different, lesser, criminalized, sinful, a whole range of other terms were used to describe LGBT lives that meant that researchers were very reluctant to do research in LGBT people's lives, and people felt that their academic careers would suffer if they did conduct research in this area. So it's a little bit of historical background. And then in terms of research, there was quite, in LGBT research, this was quite a pivotal publication. Ulrika Burmer published this systematic review in 2002. And she did a review of all Medline articles, and LGBT issues were addressed in 0.1% of all Medline articles, and of those, 60% were related to disease. They were disease specific, particularly sexual health issues. And the majority of that 0.1% made no reference to race and ethnicity. So it was very much white populations were those that were recruited to samples. And if we have time, we can talk about that as well. It's important to me. She found that there was least focus on trans health issues. And I think that's, I mean, it's interesting because I think there has been a lot of research, medical research around sex, what used to be called sex reassignment surgery and so on. So there was a lot of medical research around trans people's health, but very little around their healthcare need, how they were treated by healthcare staff and so on and so forth. And, specific needs for gender specific screening, for example, breast screening, cervical screening, prostate cancer, and so on. So LGBT health issues were neglected in public health research, and research that was unrelated to sexually transmitted disease was lacking. So that kind of framed the background to the research context in LGBT health. So in preparing for this session today, and most of it is new material, I looked on the NIHR website and did a search for LGBT, and I found no documents. And then I did another search because I thought there's got to be something, and it brought up this guidance document. I've given you the URL at the bottom, and I thought I'd give you something visual rather than the text. And LGBT populations are given a one-line mention. So there is some material here, and I think that some of these issues may well be relevant to LGBT people, but there will be lots of others that will be quite different. But I like this idea about a roadmap and where we are on the roadmap. And it might well be that you might say that, research priority setting or funding body strategic priority, I think we're probably just at that very first stage, but, you might have different thoughts about that and give me different examples about, some good examples of good practice. So, so I wanted to kind of find some previous work on reasons for underrepresentation in research, and also some examples of best practice. And I sent a tweet out about, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks ago, asking people for examples of good practice. I got a few replies, and the only reply that I've got around the inclusion and representation of LGBT people in research is was from researchers in Australia doing some research into intersex populations. And I've included that on the resources and references slide. I probably am not the person to talk to that in any great detail, partly because I've only got a limited area of expertise in that. But I'd be happy to kind of have an initial discussion with people if they wanted to. There wasn't any other examples. This was the only example. So I'm flagging it up with you because I was surprised, and this is my area of research. So, you know, in terms of where one would go to for information about inclusivity, and this is also an area that I'm interested in because I teach our PhD students on inclusivity on our doctoral training program, and I had just done a session for them 2 weeks before, and I had looked at BAME populations and not LGBT, partly because more of our students are interested in doing research with BAME communities, so I thought it was more relevant for them. So this slide that I've pulled together, I've really used some of these concepts that I found in a study that I've also referenced in the final slides around, I think it's called You Give Me Talk, I Give You Rangoli. And they've got these 3 domains of reasons for underrepresentation in research. And what I have done is I have kept the headings and then populated it with issues that I kind of think are relevant for LGBT. Some of that is from a reading that I've prepared for this session, but there's also, you know, stuff that I've kind of come across over 20, 25 years of doing research in this area that kind of, okay, this needs to go in here. And I mean, there are obvious things like, you know, perceptions that LGBTQ plus, and that's probably my preferred term, because then that would include intersex populations, and people are using much more diverse terms. People under the age of 30 use much more diverse ways of describing themselves than, you know, even 10 or 15 years ago when I was on the Department of Health steering group on sexual orientation and gender identity in 2005. So there are perceptions that LGBT people are a hidden and hard to reach group. They are a hidden group insofar as they're relatively small in the population. You know, there was once a Kinsey statistic that we represent 10% of the population, but I think that a number of surveys have suggested that it's much smaller than that. It might be 2%, it might be 5%, but still a relatively small population that is also very heterogeneous. So, which makes research much more complex and challenging because you get very small numbers in each of your participant groups. I'm going to give you some examples of the language used, and some of these issues around conceptual exclusion are in the research design, and that's the group work exercise that we're going to do part way through. It'll also talk about terminology and might also kind of think about lumping or combining experiences of diverse groups. I think there is some participants' distrust of research. Sorry, I'm slightly jumping about because I don't want to go through every single column here with you. If you do want me to talk about one in particular, do give me a little flag up or give me a thing in the chat box. I think some groups are rightly distrustful of research and researchers. It's particularly difficult. So I identify as a cisgender researcher. And if you're doing research with trans communities, people are much less likely to want to engage with a cisgender researcher unless you have a trans researcher as part of your research team, because they are worried that their experiences might be misrepresented and so on. And that has happened, and people are quite justifiably concerned about that. There's also concerns because it's a relatively small population, and when I did my survey a number of years ago, I asked people for their postcode so I could check and that it was a national survey. And actually I was pleased and surprised that I got a sample of 3 from the Outer Hebrides. And of course, if you're from such a small community, and you are a small community, you could be identifiable, probably less than they thought, but there is a kind of sense that people, and for certainly, for people over 55, that might be more of an issue than it might be for people under 35, for example. So this was a useful conceptual framework for me. I wouldn't say that it was a finished document, but it kind of it helped me to kind of think through some of the reasons why LGBT people might be less willing to take part in research, or might feel that it's actually not addressing their concerns. And let's talk about that again slightly later on. So Professor Kunti talked about Michael Marmot. I've actually taken a model he developed quite some time ago. I was part of a coordinating group, so I used to co-convene the Social Work and Health Inequalities Network and the Joint Social Work World Conference was held in Stockholm in 2012, and Michael Marmot came to talk to the conference about health inequalities, and a team of us from the coordinating group went to meet him at UCL in London. And I have high regard for his work, and certainly Fair Society, Healthy Lives talks very much more about sexual orientation and gender identity. But the world, and correct me if there's one that replaces this, the world social determinants of health that's applicable through all the countries in the world lists social economic position, social class, gender, ethnicity and racism, education, occupation and income, but doesn't include sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you think, for example, that the government have been considering for the last 18 months banning the use of conversion therapy, so under Theresa May's government, she committed to outlawing conversion therapy, where people who are LGBT are converted to heterosexuality. This practice is not entirely outlawed in the UK. You can see how on the left-hand side, the social and political context, in particular public policies, education, health, social protection, might have an impact upon LGBT people's lives. And for example, the process of banning gay men from donating blood products, that would be potentially another example. And there are lots, but we probably don't have time to go through this model in great detail. A woman in Canada has actually produced a paper, I think it was published in The Lancet, around the call for inclusion, sexual orientation as a social determinant of health. And there is increasing interest around LGBT health inequalities. I led the production of a special issue just a couple of months ago for an international journal. So why does it matter? I'm going to go through this quite quickly. I would argue that it's poor science, that I think this is across the board for if we're doing research that excludes any so-called disadvantaged, marginalised group. The research findings may not be relevant to all communities. And as we saw in Professor Kunti's presentation, different groups may respond differently to a health intervention or respond better to different health messages than to other ones, least of which, certainly as I'm in Leicester too, you know, the recognition by Public Health England that messages need to be in community languages. That's so important in a city where we have a 50-50 population in Leicester. We have our BAME population. It's a misnomer in Leicester because we have a 50-50 white BAME population in Leicester. And I think that you know, that I'd put this in my presentation before I realised Judy Beadle was doing one around disability. But the principle of no decision about me without me, I think, again, runs across all marginalised communities. And I think it underpins the moral and ethical justification for ensuring that underrepresented groups are included in research. And as I say to my PhD students, if you're serious about equality, we can't achieve social justice if we exclude groups of people from research. So those are some of the moral and ethical reasons for making sure that our research embraces equality and diversity initiatives. Equality, diversity and inclusion. So what is the current context for LGBT research? And I don't want to give you the impression that there has been no research conducted since 2002, or that all research prior to 2002 was poor, because that is not the case. For example, I'm assuming that you are aware of the NATSAL, so it's the National Attitudes and Lifestyle Survey that was conducted by UCL, I think from 1990. I think in 1990 it had 34 lesbians that took part in the study, and now the proportion in their sample is much more reflective of, I think their study suggests that there are 5% people identifying as LGBT in the UK. So over the years, they have made concerted efforts to make their study more representative. They've done CASI interviews, so you computer-aided interview techniques. I haven't looked at the latest survey, but I read something by Mercer et al. That was published in The Lancet some time ago, and you know, things are improving enormously. So it's an example of good practice. This particular piece of work that I'm just talking about now, you can access it on the internet. It's Nosy Canada. And it's developing the evidence base for policymaking in LGBTQ populations. And what I think it's interesting and important for is that they identified the number of subject categories, and the ones that had the top 10 subject categories that had more than 50 systematic reviews worldwide in. And that is the list. They found that there were many, many more for gay men, and that's reflected in the topic as well. And there was some overlap between HIV and the second one of sexual health and behaviour that was focused predominantly on gay and bisexual men, or men who have sex with men. But it's a good base. And I'm part of the Campbell collaboration, who are seeking to develop the evidence base of systematic reviews globally for LGBT people. And I think that's a really important and interesting development. We're just kind of starting work since October last year. This was our first presentation last year. And then the categories where there is least research, and because it's global, so it would include Canada and the USA, which is where most of the research is conducted, and Australia and New Zealand, those countries that describe BAME communities in terms Indigenous, because they're not, and people haven't been taken their people, had their countries taken from them. So it just gives a kind of sense around those areas where there's still more work to be done. So this is the section on group work exercise. So I'm hoping you might switch on your cameras and kind of give me, I don't know whether you want to do it in the chat. I don't know how many people are in this session. 14.
14. Yeah.
So it might be that you might, you might want to either have a conversation rather than me talking, because I've talked for a fair amount of time so far. So this was a study that was conducted, it was called Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, a survey of 15 to 29-year-olds, and it was conducted in Australia. And I just wanted, just for the sake of the exercise, is to imagine that you're an LGBTQ 18-year-old. How would you respond to the questions? And did you have a sense around how you would feel if you were asked a particular question? Which questions you think are the most or least valid? Can you suggest others? So
can I just check, would you like me to turn the recording off now at this stage?
Yes, please. I was about to, but you do it if you can.
Oh yes, okay.